What would you do if you discovered that someone close to you had led a life of unimaginable complexity? This funeral revealed truths that changed everything at Evergreen Hollow Cemetery. The crowd gathered in silence around a freshly dug grave, the faint murmur of those present mingling with the soft whisper of the wind. Friends, family, and neighbors had gathered to bid farewell to Jonathan Winslow, a man known for his dedication to altruism and his warm influence on the community. Under the glow of the evening sun, the black granite tombstone gleamed, inscribed with the words, "A legacy of service and sacrifice." Among the attendees, an elderly African-American woman, subtly but unintentionally, drew attention. Her dress, a deep emerald green, fell with modest elegance, and her carefully combed silver hair rested beneath a brimmed hat. She discreetly held a single red rose in her hands, which remained steady, though her eyes betrayed a whirlwind of emotions. These emotions seemed to overtake the rest of those present as mourners exchanged words of consolation. Most did not recognize the woman. She stood quietly on the fringes of the group, emanating a presence both solemn and enigmatic. It was only when the officiant finished his last prayer that she advanced with a leisurely pace towards the grave. The sound of the gravel crunching under her shoes echoed as the crowd moved aside, clearing the way for her to pass. When she reached the tomb, she paused, staring at the gleaming coffin with a solemn gaze. Then, with reverent gentleness, she laid the rose on the shiny surface before turning toward the crowd. "My name is Eleanor Hardwell," she announced, her voice firm and full of conviction. "It is likely that few of you will recognize me, but I knew Jonathan better than anyone here." An uneasy murmur rippled through the crowd. Incredulous glances crossed their brows and whispers began to flow, laden with curiosity. Who was this woman? How could she proclaim such an intimate connection with the man they all thought they knew completely? Eleanor's gaze slowly shifted between the puzzled faces. Her expression remained serene, but there was an unwavering determination in her voice as she continued. "Before this day is over, you will understand why I am here, and you will meet the Jonathan Winslow that many of you never got to see." The weight of her words hung in the air, laden with mystery. What Eleanor was about to reveal promised to upset the certainties of those who had gathered to honor his memory. The murmurs faded away little by little, replaced by the rustle of the leaves stirred by the wind. Eleanor inhaled deeply, and when she spoke again, her voice projected a quiet authority that demanded absolute attention. "Jonathan knew 50 years ago," she began, her gaze lost in a past that seemed to unfold in front of her. "It wasn't here in this city. It was in Montgomery, Alabama, during a time when people like me were not welcome in places like this." The crowd leaned forward almost in unison, with eyes full of curiosity and anticipation. Eleanor continued, her voice imbued with a mixture of pride and melancholy. "Jonathan was just a young man at the time, full of passion and dreams. He worked as a teacher, but his true purpose was in the civil rights movement. It was there that our lives crossed on the steps of a church." A muffled murmur ran through the attendees. The Jonathan they knew was a generous and kind man, but no one in that group had ever heard about this facet of his life or his connection to such a momentous struggle. "The impact of his words resonates," she said before continuing. "Jonathan and I were not just partners in the struggle for justice," she said, softening her tone. "We were more than friends. We became each other's family in a world that seemed determined to keep us apart. He was by my side when I lost my sister due to the violence of that time, and I was there for him when he had to rebuild his life after being rejected by those who should have supported him." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted the brim of her hat. Her eyes remained fixed on the coffin. "We shared meals, stories, and tears. He used to call me his sister, in every way that really mattered, even when it wasn't safe for him to say it out loud." The air seemed to get heavier as the crowd stirred uncomfortably. The crowd swayed, taking in every word. It was difficult to reconcile this version of Jonathan with the man they thought they knew, a dashing benefactor who had touched so many lives but who never spoke of his own, nor of the battles he faced. But he continued with a firmer tone. "What I am telling you is not just about a distant past. It's about the man who forged himself through those battles." He paused, slowly scanning the crowd with his gaze, letting the silence settle like a deep echo. What Eleanor shared next would transcend their relationship, revealing sacrifices that none of those present could have imagined. With her hands clutching tightly to her purse, Eleanor stood up, and her rock-steady voice echoed between them. We not only survived those difficult years, we fought with every fiber of our being to overcome them. But that fight came at a cost. It demanded sacrifices that left scars on both of us, scars that most of you will never see. Eleanor scanned the crowd, her incisive eyes fixed on theirs as if daring anyone to turn away. In 1967, Jonathan lost his job for participating in a march in Selma, she said, her tone charged with gravity. The school board accused him of inappropriate behavior, but we all knew it was nothing more than retaliation. He didn't tell anyone here about it because he didn't want them to see him as an object of pity. He packed up what little he had and moved into a small one-room house in South Montgomery, surviving by working as a tutor but never giving up his struggle. Eleanor's voice trembled for a moment but continued with the same determination. When they burned down my house in retaliation for hosting meetings, it was Jonathan who appeared in the middle of the night, driving his car to take my two nephews and me to safety without hesitation, aware of the risk he was taking. She turned toward the coffin, her expression softening as if the memory of those moments brought her a mixture of sadness and gratitude. That was Jonathan, not the elegant man in the tailored suit that many of you remember, but someone who endured great trials for the people he cared about. The crowd stood in absolute silence, absorbed by her words, as Eleanor pulled a small piece of folded paper from her purse. It's a letter that Jonathan wrote to me in 1972. I want to read you just a part of it, she said, lifting the paper with a steady hand. She unfolded the letter carefully, her slightly trembling hands a clear reflection of what that memory meant. She began to read quietly, her trembling but determined tone filling the air. Eleanor, you are the sister I chose when life gave me none. We have carried burdens together that no one should carry, but I would carry them again for you without a thought. You remind me every day that love is not about blood, but about who's by your side when the world turns its back on you. Eleanor's voice broke at the last line, and she had to pause to regain her composure. The crowd, once so motionless, was now visibly moved. Some were wiping their eyes while others stared at the ground in shame for not having known this side of the man to whom they had come to pay tribute. Jonathan never turned his back on anyone, said Eleanor, folding the letter carefully again. Not even when it cost him everything. And yet, how many of you here knew any of this? How many of you cared enough to ask? She let the question hover in the air like an invisible weight pressing down on the group. The silence grew thicker as the truth about Jonathan's sacrifices settled in their hearts. But as that knowledge settled, Eleanor revealed something even more profound, an act of bravery that would forever change the way they would remember him. The air grew even thicker as Eleanor continued, her words imbued with both pain and defiance. There is one more truth about Jonathan, a truth that none of you would have imagined, but which defined everything he was. The crowd tensed, every gaze fixed on her, waiting for the next word while Eleanor took a breath to steady herself. Jonathan not only fought for others, he fought a battle that remained hidden for years. He kept secret the fact that he supported a son he could not openly acknowledge because of his mother's identity. A collective sigh ran through those present. The faces of the crowd were astonished, but Eleanor did not falter. She did not hesitate, and she went ahead with her story. Samuel was born to a woman Jonathan could not marry because of the time and place in which they lived. The child was black like me, and Jonathan was forced to keep it a secret for fear of the repercussions it would have on his career and reputation. Whispers grew, and incredulous glances were exchanged everywhere. But the pain was not over. I was there when Samuel was born, Eleanor said quietly, and Jonathan made sure that child never lacked for anything. He paid for his education, wrote him letters every week, and visited him whenever he could. Under the shadow of darkness, he did everything he could to make sure Samuel had what he never had, the love of a father, even if it was a silent love. Tears clouded her eyes, but her voice remained unwavering. And Samuel, the man whose existence they did not know, is here today. At that instant, a tall man stepped forward from the back of the crowd. His presence was impressive, with broad shoulders and a serene dignity reflected in his every movement. The resemblance to Jonathan was unmistakable. The crowd turned to look at him in stunned silence. In absolute silence, Samuel walked to Eleanor and, with a silent gentleness, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said softly, his throat tight with emotion, "for everything." Eleanor smiled up at him through her tears, her expression full of respect and affection. "It was always an honor," she said. Then she turned to the crowd and addressed them. "Jonathan loved each of you in his own way, but his truest love was found in the people he fought for, those of us who did not have the luxury of being seen by respectable society. That is why I am here today, to make sure you know the real man behind all those masks." The silence that followed was not only one of amazement, but of deep reflection, as if each of them was facing a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. Before the mourners could fully process what they had just learned, Eleanor had one last story to tell, an act of bravery that would forever seal Jonathan's legacy. The crowd stood still, the weight of Eleanor's words falling on them like a blanket too dense to remove. The murmurs that had filled the air before faded away, giving way to a deep silence. All eyes were fixed on Samuel, who stood firm and serene beside Eleanor, his presence a palpable testimony of the secrets Jonathan had brought with him. An older man standing near the front cleared his throat, breaking the silence with a trembling voice. "I didn't know it," he said, stuttering. "Jonathan never said a word about it." Eleanor's gaze softened as she watched him. "He wasn't the kind of man I was looking for. Praise for doing the right thing," she replied. "But make no mistake, he carried the weight of those sacrifices every day of his life." A middle-aged woman with a tear-stained face stepped forward, hesitant. "When my father lost his job," she said in a soft voice, "I thought I understood his kindness. But now I see it was much deeper than I imagined." Eleanor nodded, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Jonathan didn't give just for convenience. He gave because he understood what it meant to lack, and he never wanted anyone to experience that pain." The group began to move, fragments of their own memories of Jonathan surfacing. Each shared story painted the portrait of a man whose generosity and strength were deeply rooted in a life that few had come to truly understand. But it wasn't just memories that hung in the air. There was also guilt. Many began to realize that they only knew the polished version of Jonathan, the man who wore his success as a shield to hide the struggles he had faced as a young man. An older man in the background finally spoke, his trembling voice breaking the silence. "It's not fair," he said, clenching his fists. "He deserved to be celebrated for everything he did, not just for the parts we chose to see." Eleanor turned to him, his expression softening. "You're right," he replied. "But Jonathan was not a man who sought recognition. He cared about the impact of his life, and his greatest legacy was not the plaques on the walls or the accolades in his programs, but the lives he touched, yours, mine, and Samuel's." Samuel stepped forward, his voice firm and resonant. "My father always told me that the true measure of a person is not in what he leaves behind in objects, but in what he leaves behind in people. And standing here today, I see that he left much more than I ever imagined." The crowd seemed to breathe in unison, their collective guilt giving way to a deeper understanding of the man they had come to mourn. Tears began to fall freely, not only for the loss of Jonathan, but for the deep revelation of his unseen sacrifices. As the crowd began to understand the full weight of Jonathan's life, Eleanor prepared to share one last moment that would change them forever. He took a moment to calm down, his hands tightly clasped as he looked out over the crowd. The air was thick with not only grief, but also a renewed respect for the man they thought they knew. But there was still one last story that needed to be shared, a final act of bravery that would forever define Jonathan's legacy. 2 months before Jonathan passed away, Eleanor's voice began to grow softer. "He called me. He was not well, but his spirit was still unwavering. He told me he was setting up a trust, not for him or his legacy, but for the children of this community, children whose parents struggle to make ends meet, children who deserve opportunities but are often ignored." The crowd began to stir, a mixture of surprise and awe. They knew he would not live to see the trust fund in action. "But that didn't matter to him," Eleanor continued, his voice cracking slightly. "What mattered to him was planting the seed, making sure it would grow long after he was gone." Samuel stepped forward again, adding to his mother's words. That trust is real, he said firmly. It has already been established and will offer scholarships, after-school programs, and mentoring for needy children. My father wanted his life to have a purpose, not only for the people he met, but for the generations that would come after him. Eleanor looked around, finding the gaze of every mourner. That was Jonathan's greatest legacy, he said. He didn't need recognition or applause. He just wanted to know that he had done his part in making the world a little better. A long silence followed, the weight of his words striking a deep chord in the hearts of all present. Some nodded silently, others wiped away tears, and a few remained motionless, lost in thought. Eleanor placed his hand on the polished tombstone, his voice softening. I leave you with this question. How do you want to be remembered? Not for the things you had or the titles you won, but by the lives you touched and the love you gave? He turned to the crowd, his kind but firm expression unwavering. If Jonathan taught us one thing, it is that true legacy is not written in stone. It is written in the hearts of the people. The crowd seemed to collectively exhale, the emotional weight giving way to quiet reflection. Eleanor gave a final nod to Samuel before stepping back, allowing the moment to settle. As the mourners began to disperse, many approached Eleanor and Samuel, offering words of gratitude and promises to honor Jonathan's legacy. The cemetery, once a place of somber finality, had been transformed into a space of renewed purpose. May this story serve as a reminder that kindness and sacrifice often go unnoticed but never forgotten. Remember Jonathan's lesson. Live a life that leaves a lasting impact on others.